was born in 79 and I grew up in Vietnam after the war ended. But I know that my parents fought in the war, even though my father never had to pick up a gun and shoot people or had to be in a jungle. But I do believe that he and my mother kind of help or somehow fought in the war. Because when I grew up, I saw two pieces of paper on the wall, and it has to do with something like recognition from the government for contribution to the revolution.
So if they were involved, then they were involved helping the Viet Cong then?
I'm sure, yes, because my mother and my dad are from Hanoi,
Okay.
and we moved south in 1977. They were very educated. So my dad works in forestry and my mother worked in education. So they were sent south to kind of, the term could rebuilding the South. So a lot of people back then who were educated from the north was sent or shipped to the south to take over like important position in the government.
I see. So since they lived in the north, then maybe they helped not so much with the Viet Cong, but just helped some way with the military effort from the north.
Right, right, right.
But it sounds like you're not really sure. So is that one of the things where you think that they were involved, but you're not really sure about it?
Because I grew up and I never heard of them talking about, like the battlefield, or like, fallen soldiers or comrades. They never had to kind of suffer from trauma. But I saw on the wall, two pieces of paper that I told you, the recognition by the government for something like great contribution to the revolution.
Yeah,
So I don't know what they did. They
sure.
never talk about it.
And are they still alive?
My mother died last year, and my
Oh,
dad died when I was 19.
okay. Is this one of those situations that you hear about so many times? Young people aren't very interested in the past, not so interested, their parents are boring, so not very interested in their parents' stories. But is this one of those things where as you move on in life, you look back and say, I wish I had asked my parents what they remembered about that time?
I would blame the way history has been taught in Vietnam. The reason a lot of Vietnamese students and the younger generation not caring too much about history is because history is taught tediously in the country, and it's taught in a way that um, the student felt like they had to memorize too many facts without understanding, the causes, the conflicts, the problems, the issues, the trauma of the people. So history has been taught in a way of, I would use the term indoctrination, that we are a great country. We had fought a lot of invaders and foreign people to win independence, and a lot of time, oftentimes, we had to memorize too many facts. And
Hmm.
I remember when I was in the ninth grade, I had to memorize, from page one to page 200 something
Oh, good
of
grief.
the history textbook
Huh.
for the exam to transfer to high school, and it was awful. I mean, like we had to memorize every single word. So it's not like how you guys in the US study history. So that's why people my generation and a lot of young people nowadays, they hate history.
Wow.
It's
So,
all about memorizations.
yeah, so history as a collection of facts, but not history as something that involved living, thinking human beings. And
No.
oh,
And when yeah,
yeah,
and when you contextualize history with literature in Vietnam, um, oftentimes, when they select a text to put in a textbook, it has to reflect the government's ideology. So even though we keep saying that, all right, after the reform period of 1986, literature has moved on, to portray new ideas, new things, more reality.
yeah.
But the text that they select for the textbook from grade 1 to grade 12 are always about indoctrination and one-sided view of history. So that's why students hate it.
So then that leads to a question. So then suppose as we're speaking, it's late at night now in Vietnam. Um, but tomorrow morning, in Saigon, in Da Nang, in Hue, in Quang Tri, in Nha Trang, there are going to be a lot of Vietnamese in their late 60s and their 70s who were, on the South Vietnamese side. They were ARVN soldiers, or they somehow supported the ARVN soldiers, or they were with the regional forces. Are they free at all to share their experiences, or is it just understood that their side of the story just should not be discussed?
I have not talked with any of those who still remain in Vietnam because I left the country when I was 21 years old. So I only have access to the stories by the refugees living in the US. And
Oh,
oftentimes the stories or the memories of the South Vietnamese people, the former South Vietnamese people, are not considered legal, or I would say official, um, or what's the word that they use here? Um, Orthodox, because they represent, the voices of the betrayer, of the puppets of the Americans,
mhm.
of the losers. So all of those things. And today is actually the called the Veteran and Memorial Day in Vietnam, the 27th of July. So all the cemetery for the fallen soldiers, the whole nation is commemorating the death of the fallen soldiers. So it's all over the country from north to south.
I
But
see.
somehow it only has to do with the people who fought against the French and the people who fought against the Americans, but not the South Vietnamese army.
So, so the day then for an ARVN soldier, for a regional forces um, soldier, today is just the day to be quiet. I mean, every day is a day to be quiet, but especially today, be quiet because no one wants to hear about what you did fighting for the South.
Nope. And also, this day um, is designed by the Vietnamese government. So it's only kind of, commemorates the death and the sacrifice of the people who fought on their side.
I mean, which is significant. You go to Vietnam and you see these cemeteries, and there's just one, I mean, just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tombstones that basically say, we don't know who this
Hmm.
soldier was. I mean, the loss is incredible. Here in the States, there was a lot of time and energy, and there still is time and energy put into trying to recover the remains of soldiers, Marines, sailors lost in World War II and the Korean War.
Hmm.
There's that sense that, unless we have something physical that we can bury and we know what human being was attached to that thing, even if, I mean, there's a case where, they found, I think, like a piece of jewelry and a tooth. And they put the piece of jewelry and a tooth in a coffin and said, well, this is him. And so now, and there's that sense of relief. In Vietnam, there are so many Vietnamese soldiers, and here we can focus on North Vietnamese, who were lost. And I mean, you've seen them, just these thousands of tombstones that, basically say this is a martyr, but we don't know who. What toll, if any, does that take on Vietnam today? Is that still something that lives in the minds of older people, that we lost so many in that war and we have no idea where their remains are?
There has been a lot of research and studies on the finding of the remains of the fallen soldiers. And I would say that this has become a traumatic experience for the living members of those families, of those fallen soldiers. Because according to Vietnamese culture and tradition, if the body is not found, then the soul remains homeless and
Mm.
lost. So it's important for the living to find the remains of the fallen soldiers so that they can bury that appropriately or properly, because they believe that if the remains are found and buried properly, then the soul finds a home. The soul of the dead return to the home of their family, and they will be taken care of. They will be attended. They will be forgotten, and they won't be like homeless soul, lost soul wandering around like ghosts. So that has always been a traumatic experience for the living. And every single day, I know that a lot of psychic and also a lot of veterans join a team to find the remains of their comrades.
Wow. So in the minds and the hearts of many, many, many thousands of Vietnamese, will just say they live every day with this idea that the souls of their loved ones who are lost in some in the 50s fighting the French, all the way up to 75,
Mm,
that the souls of their loved ones are what? Just kind of wandering around the mountains, wandering around,
right,
just kind
like
of
hungry
homeless.
ghosts. Yes. Hmm.
Wow. And is that just kind of, I mean, how would you describe the effect that that has on people? Is it just kind of something that's just kind of always there in the back of their minds, just kind of something that's just maybe it's a low grade kind of thing, but something that's always just kind of tugging at people?
There's a difference in terms of cultural practices. Like in the West, we celebrate birthdays. And so in Asian culture, of course, we kind of, borrow that, concept. And now we also do the birthday thing. But traditionally, we only had death anniversaries.
Wow.
Okay, so that's had to do with Chinese culture, Korean culture, Vietnamese culture. So every year they would kind of burn incense and like cook a meal to offer to the dead in the home. So if they have a photo of the dead on the altar or on the shrine, and there's no grave, there's no where that they can go to, then they always think that okay, so we don't know if the dead can return to the home and enjoy the offerings. If we don't know if the dead will be here to like to come back to the family and acknowledge the fact that we remember you guys, or they remember the fallen soldiers. So I'm sure that any family in Vietnam who has a beloved one who lost in the war, whose remains haven't been found yet, I'm sure that they are all traumatized by that. And a lot of them pay a lot of money and they go to different jungles, places, former battlefields with the hope of finding the remains so that they can retrieve it, bury it appropriately in the cemetery or, in their family's grave. And
Wow.
that's called the relief. If they cannot do that, they will be tormented forever, mentally and emotionally.
Listening to you talk, I mean, what brings us together is that you and a colleague edited short stories by Bao Nin, if I have the, the
Yes.
American pronunciation of that
Mhm.
name correct. And of course, his most famous work, I believe, is in English, is The Sorrow of War. Is that right? And this would be part of The Sorrow of War, which leads me to think that many times to Vietnam veterans here in the US, I have said that my impression was that the Vietnam War is much more alive in the United States still than it is in Vietnam because of the all of the ongoing arguments that we have in the States. But listening to you talk, I think I'm wondering if I'm wrong about that. If the war is still very much alive in Vietnam, just in a different way. Here in the United States, there's a lot of arguing, and sometimes it gets political. Vietnam veterans who have different political views. It so what you've said is you're not going to have arguing about political views because there's really only one view that you're allowed to
Mhm.
talk about, but that the war is very much alive in Vietnam, but in a very different way. Do you think that's right?
I think you're right. The war still has a big impact on the people who kind of lived through it, but not upon the younger generation. Like Bao Ning, of course, I'm sure that he's tormented every single day by the war. A lot of soldiers or veterans, like today, this morning, I read the news, and I saw a lot of veterans going to the cemetery to burn incense to their fallen comrades, and they cry. And a lot of them, now they retire, they would spend all of their time, to take care of or to attend the graves of the fallen soldier in the cemetery, to make sure that, again, the souls are taken care of and they are not cold. So with the incense, they will enjoy some of the warmth, the coziness, some kind of caring and love from the living. So
Wow.
when you say that, let's say, the war is now the past in Vietnam, it's partly true, because Bảo Ninh, he said that the Vietnamese have learned to put the past aside and move on. Because if we keep harboring the hatred, the resentment, it's poisonous and
Mm.
it's not good for the living. So the good practice, the good lesson is that yes, we do acknowledge the past. We know that we have suffered. We know that we have lost a lot of people, but we don't nurture hatred and resentment. And we got to move on, because life has more to do with forgiveness. Life has more to do with earning a living, supporting your family, spending time with loved one, instead of just holding that hatred every single day. So I think that has to do with how Vietnam is, or kind of perceive itself in terms of the aftermath.
So a little bit of a, on the one hand, especially among the older people, this, ongoing sense that our loved ones have not been buried, their souls are wandering. Um, on the other hand, a country, where the young people, as you've said, because the way history is taught, there's not an interest in history. Young people are moving on. Um, the country has experienced a lot of economic growth, and so in another sense, a lot of people are just moving on. But I want to ask you about the Vietnamese communities here in the States. Now, obviously, you can't speak for the entire Vietnamese community in the United States. I'm just interested in your own perceptions. Um, it's interesting because I've noticed, there were political rallies a couple years ago, and a lot of people were waving American flags. I noticed that at the political rallies in Orange County, California, there were American flags waving, but I also saw a lot of flags from the old Republic of South Vietnam. I saw those flags waving too, and I thought, gosh, that's interesting. Why are they waving that flag? Um, so I'm interested in, what's your sense of how the Vietnam War is still alive among the Vietnamese community in the United States, just based on your own perception?
The refugees in the U.S. define their identity based on the war and why they had to leave the country to resettle in the West. Therefore, they always hold on to the South Vietnamese flag, and they refuse to acknowledge the communist flag, because according to their political perspective, the Vietnamese communist flag represent blood, um, oppression, indoctrination, lack of freedom, all of those things. And because they claim that they lost the South and they have to leave the country and live here, so they need some kind of national identity to tell the American that we are here because you guys were there.
Mm,
And we are here because we couldn't survive, we couldn't bear the life of oppression over there.
mm,
So the flag represent their solidarity. The flag represent the past that the government in Vietnam always denies. The flag represent, I would say, their nostalgia,
mm.
but also their political ideology. That we,
Anti-communist,
yeah,
anti-socialist. Yeah.
the refugees are not communist.
If you ask American veterans, so did, you know, why did the US, or why did the side the US was with why did that side not win the war? In other words, why is South Vietnam not an independent country today? You'll hear a lot of different answers. Some answers will be we never should have gotten there in the first place. Others will be, the war, the way the war was prosecuted was too political, and you'll hear a lot of different responses. In your experience, how do refugees who live in the States answer that question? Why why was South Vietnam not successful in maintaining its independence? What's their explanation for that?
There's one thing that I have found from reading Vietnamese American literature is that rarely do they acknowledge the corruption of the government in the South.
Mhm.
So they keep blaming the communists for corruption, all of those things, but they rarely acknowledge or even recognize the fact that the president of South Vietnam, Thieu and Diem, all of those people, one who's an oppressor and one who's corrupt, right?
Yeah.
And I believe that they said that they never talk about, why they lost the war. I think the only thing that they said is that the American abandoned them. And somehow they kind of blame the Americans for abandoning South Vietnam, and that's why it fell into the hands of the communists.
Is the result of this then that there are conversations that Vietnamese refugees have among themselves? For example, when the North was sweeping through the South, President Ford wanted more resources to send to South Vietnam, and the Congress said no. And so a lot of Americans interpret that as we were abandoning our ally. And so are these conversations that will take place among Vietnamese refugees, but they're unlikely to say them aloud, that, you know, the reason we're here is because our ally abandoned us.
Mhm.
Are those conversations they'll have in private, but are not likely to say aloud?
Yes, I think Lan Cao, in her book *The Lotus and the Storm*, she said that. But a lot of times, the refugee only said something like, "We are here because we couldn't stand the oppression and the indoctrination of the government." And only a few authors talk about we are here because the American abandoned us. So it also varies from author to author.
Yeah, sure you.
But I think the most common perspective is that they are here because they couldn't stand or they were mistreated by the US, by the communist government back home.
Right. And in your experience, there is a great reluctance to recognize what I think is just objectively true, that the governments of South Vietnam were just pervasively corrupt.
Yes, and I think historians all over the world
Yeah.
have said that. It's not just how the Vietnamese people at home said that, but also when you look at historians and books written by Westerners and all the statistics and the facts, that was the truth.
You're not saying this, but what comes to my mind is, whatever you think about communism, it is an ideology, or nationalism. Let's focus even more on
Mhm.
nationalism. That's an idea that can really fire a person up. You can become just devoted to that. We're going to
Mhm.
unite this country. This country's been invaded by the Chinese, by the French, by the Japanese, by the French again. Now here are the Americans and the Australians and the South Koreans. And we're going to get them all out of the country. We're going to unite this country. Um, I mean, that's a powerful idea that can motivate people. And then in the South, as we've said, well, what's the driving force there? The government is just hopelessly corrupt. What are it's easy to understand what we're committed to from the perspective of the North. What are we committed to from the perspective of the South? We just have another president and he's just as corrupt as the previous one.
Mhm.
Does that make sense to you?
Yes, and I could be interested in looking into the propaganda used by both sides during the war. So I only have access to the propaganda used by the communists, right? So all the soldiers from the north, uh, of course, had to learn about propaganda, and the communists were pretty good at that, and they are still very good at that, right? So I'm curious, and I don't know about this, how the South Vietnamese government use propaganda to kind of either brainwash or inspire their
Mm.
soldiers, because we don't have access to those things.
Oh, yeah, that's
So
interesting.
it would be great to look at, into the propaganda and say, okay, what are the reason why there was such a big difference had to do with how soldiers access propaganda, or how each government use propaganda to kind of, inspire their soldiers. And
Sure.
we don't have access to the other side.
You don't, yeah. That's interesting. I wonder if one place with that, there are a lot of leaflets that would be handed out to villages or dropped from helicopters and things, and
Mhm.
the leaflets have statements on them. I'm sure that that's where you get a lot of that stuff. I want to ask you about Bao Nin, just my own relationship with his work. I actually found his book Sorrow of War. I had not heard of him before, but I was in a bookstore in Da Nang, and that's where small English section in the
Mhm.
bookstore in Da Nang, and that's where I found his Sorrow of War, and actually read it, flying home from Vietnam.
Mhm.
And then what brings us together is that you have, or the book that I'm familiar with, Hanoi and I, collection of stories from Bao Ninh that you have translated and edited with a colleague. In your mind, what is the importance of Bao Ninh, of his work?
I would say this: Bao Ning is a great storyteller, and he doesn't try to promote what I call the term epic heroism
Mm,
that the government in Vietnam used to what is it, prescribe to authors. And Bao Ning tried to write about the war truthfully, that this is what soldiers went through. These are the losses and the suffering and the traumas and the griefs that we have to deal with, right? So he deviates from the term called glorification of the war. Was the war victorious or not? That's
mm,
a big question. And number two, um, Bao Ning doesn't try to be too political or use lit as propaganda in his fiction. So I think those are the two great things. And the most important thing that I want to emphasize is a lot of times the refugees in the US always say that because the communists won the war, they were not victims of trauma because they were the victors.
mm,
The Americans said that, well, we lost the war. You guys won the war. Therefore, American veterans suffer from PTSD. And you, the Vietnamese at home, don't have to go through this. Bao Ning's fiction proves that the war damages anyone who got involved in it, whether you are a victor or you are a loser. So I think that is important because it debunks the myth of the communists as what people who find a jungle without emotion, people who find a jungle and eat on a bowl of rice
mm.
and never have to worry about their own heart, their feelings, their romance, their loved ones, and they're just like robots fighting, right? So I think his fiction is trying to say that the Vietnamese, the communists, they are human beings just like everyone else, and war damages everyone who was involved in it.
Yeah, it's a couple things come to my mind as you're talking. You read Bao Ninh and you read American memoirs of the war, and they feel exactly the same.
Hmm.
You know, they feel the same. Um, and then there's that idea of, well, our guys were suffering not only because of combat, but they were suffering because of the leeches and the snakes and the heat and the humidity.
Hmm.
But the NVA were sort of automatons who had
Hmm.
feelings. The snakes didn't bother them. The mosquitoes didn't bother them. They lived on a spoonful of rice a day.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and so this work challenges that too, that no, what we're talking about are human beings who, that maybe the North Vietnamese had a little bit of an advantage because they'd grown up in that environment and were more acclimated.
Hmm.
Still, it's incredibly difficult. But I think that the most important point there that you made was you read Bao Ninh You read an American veteran just talking about the war, and they feel the
Hmm.
same. It doesn't matter who wins. And you don't read Baonin's work and walk away thinking, gosh, he's really happy he was on the winning side.
Hmm.
You feel like, no, he thinks this whole thing was a tragedy.
I think you're right. And the American war in Vietnam was actually a Vietnamese tragedy rather than an American tragedy.
Hmm. Why do you say that? What's flesh that out?
Because I have read a lot of scholarship, and when you read Vietnam War history and literature written by U.S. veteran and historians,
Yeah,
they always portray the Vietnamese as the invisible, someone who stay in the background, and somehow the Americans were fighting the invisible. Okay, and the Americans' master narratives focus primarily on the suffering, the trauma of their veterans, while ignoring or disregarding or even glossing over the suffering of the Vietnamese home. But when you compare, how many people die in the war, right? You can see that, wow, I mean, the Vietnamese at home suffer more, how many times more, right? So I think that by bringing Vietnamese lit in translation into, the corpus of Vietnam War lit, especially to Western audience, as a scholar, I'm trying to say that the war was actually the Vietnamese tragedy.
sure. Yeah. Now, Bound in the way he writes, war is not glorious.
Hmm.
Yeah, our side won, but it's a tragedy.
Hmm.
Um, but of course, when you're in Vietnam, you see a lot of, there's a lot of messaging about the glorious victory of the war. And so how was Boundin's work received by the government? Was the government okay with him writing about the war in this way?
Um, the good thing is that after 1986, writers have been allowed to be more truthful and realistic in their writing. Therefore, nowadays, of course, I think authors can write about the war just like the way Browning does, and they should be fine. But let's say before 1986, authors had been expected to portray the war as a glorious war, that it was a heroic war. It was about, heroic sacrifices. A mother sent their children to fight the war, and even if their children die on the battlefield, the mother still feel like, proud, and feel like, what's the term that they use here? Noble, because they could do that. But the reality is, if you lose your children in the war, that kind of burden you have to carry with you, for the rest of your life, right? So some of I think one of the stories in the collection, the last one, called Untamed Winds.
Mm,
When Browning published that story in, I believe, the mid 90s, it was banned or censored in Vietnam for a few years. So in Vietnam, when you talk about censorship, oftentimes it's not like a permanent censorship, but it's like it depends on the period. So sometimes the government would say, well, this story is not appropriate for the public audience. But maybe 5 years later, when the climate change, the situation change a little bit, the perspective change a little bit, they say, okay, now we just can ignore that, and then the work is okay.
sure.
So in that collection, I think the last one was banned for, I believe, a few years.
Do you know why? What was it in that particular story that was a problem? Do you know that?
Because it has to do with this singer from South Vietnam and the romance between an NVA soldier and that singer who will consider like a slut or a whore. And somehow that story portrayed the fact that, wait, NVA soldiers are human beings. They have romantic love, they have some kind of, crush over a woman, or they have this kind of thing, and they're not like idealistic fighters who only live, for the cause of the war. And also this kind of reunion between, the singer and the NVA has more to do with, like the harmony between the two sides. So I think all of those things made the story kind of problematic according to the view of the government.
I see. Sort of this romantic relationship between the NBA soldier and the woman from the South. In your perception, are there still cultural differences between North and South Vietnam that are still detectable? I know that there are linguistic differences, but are there cultural differences that you think can be traced back to that time in 54 when 1954 when a lot of folks from the north moved south and some folks from the south moved north based on ideological disposition? And do you, do you think that there are still discernible cultural differences between the north and the south that can be traced to that period?
Yes, I'm sure. People keep saying that Hanoi or the North has more to do with politics, while the South has more to do with, economics, right?
Hmm,
And when you look at the national holidays, when you look at photographs, on the newspaper, in the newspaper, mo almost every single household in the North hang the communist flag, up front, at the front door. But you don't in the South you see that too, but it's not as popular at how they do in the north. And also when you go to the north, you see a lot of common people, like the taxi driver, the motorbike taxi driver, the vendors, old veteran wearing, the kind of, helmet that you often see in the war, walking
sure.
around. You don't see that in Saigon,
Right.
right? You don't see that in Saigon at all.
Hmm,
When I first came to the US in 2001, that was the first time I had access to refugees writing, and I was able to learn or to read history from, I would say, the other side. And I started to question what I had been taught in Vietnam. Okay. So I was a bit kind of ambivalent about this is what I had learned before I came to the US. And this is like the new idea or the new picture of history that I just got exposed to. And at that time, I kind of leaned more toward the refugee side because I felt like this seemed to be like the more truthful portrayal of history. So that's when I first came to the US. And then the longer I live here, the more I read, the more I look into history textbook and talk to people. And then the older I get, when I reflect, upon the history of Vietnam, I realize that, oh, history is not that simple.
hmm,
And now, so I'm trying to find some kind of a common ground, like a neutral point in my scholarship. And so I try to talk about the wars from multiple perspectives instead of, leaning towards just one side. So I think as a critic and a scholar, you got to be informed and try not to be biased as much as you can. Of course, we are all biased, right? The problem that I see a lot in Vietnamese American refugees and scholarship has to do with the fact that they often dehumanize the Vietnamese communists at home. For example, when you look at Monkey Bridge by Lan Cao, the first Vietnamese American novel to be published in the US in 1997, she portrayed the American guy Michael as the angel, the savior, and all the communists are called like ants and like insects and like they got dehumanized. And a lot of memoirs written by the refugees also dehumanized the communists after the war. Well, then we have to raise a question: uh, are the communists inhuman or subhuman beings?
hmm,
So I would say that my perspective keeps changing because it depends on how much I have read, and I have to question and critique everything instead of taking everything for granted. And I like what Viet Thanh Nguyen said in his book Nothing Ever Dies. He said that it's important for all sides to acknowledge and recognize their own inhumanities. Because if we keep celebrating our humanity and impose the inhumanity upon the other side, then the kind of reconciliation or peace would never be achieved. Because when anyone fought in a war, all sides committed crimes and all sides probably did some kind of noble things. So it's important for the Americans, for the refugees, even for the communists to talk and to address their own inhumanities alongside with their humanity.